"I'm not clean," she whispered, and when the cloth fell, the rancher's heart stopped. The Hayes Ranch was a windswept kingdom carved from a land that bled loneliness, stark beauty, and a quiet, simmering grief. Gideon Hayes worked the fence line, his movements methodical, precise. This was his world: straight lines and hard truths. He ran an ace-high operation, a testament to the sweat and silence he'd poured into this unforgiving earth since burying his Mary. But the new housekeeper, Lydia Shaw, was a line he couldn't straighten. She moved with a whisper, her eyes holding a sorrow that echoed his own, yet was of a different, darker brand. He hammered the post, the sound a lonely heartbeat against the plains. He'd hired her for a steady hand, not for the secrets he saw swimming in her gaze. He didn't know it yet, but he was mending the last barrier around his heart, and soon a whispered confession would fall from her lips, followed by a revelation that would shatter it completely. The Hayes Ranch was a windswept kingdom carved from a land that bled loneliness, stark beauty, and a quiet, simmering grief. It was a world of straight lines and hard truths, a lonely testament to the sweat Gideon Hayes had poured into the unforgiving earth since burying his Mary 3 years prior. He worked the fence line now, his movements methodical, precise. Each pull of the wire, each hammer strike against the post was a rhythm against the crushing silence. Out here, a man could measure his existence in acres claimed and cattle fed. It was a simple, brutal ledger, and it was all he had left. The midday sun beat down, turning the distant mesas into shimmering, watery illusions. He paused, wiping a forearm across his brow, his gaze sweeping the horizon out of habit. Nothing but the endless roll of prairie and a sky so vast it could swallow a man's soul. That's when he saw it. A dust devil, small and insignificant, at first growing larger as it followed the town road. But it wasn't a dust devil. It was the mail coach, and it was stopping at his turnoff. Gideon's jaw tightened. He wasn't expecting supplies for another week. He secured the wire and began the long walk back to the homestead, a stark, 2-story sentinel of timber he'd built with his own hands. The house, like him, was solid, lonely, and held its secrets close. He reached the porch just as the coach pulled away, leaving a solitary figure standing beside a small, worn carpet bag. She was slighter than he'd imagined, wrapped in a plain, travel-stained dress. The wind whipped loose strands of dark hair across a face that was pale with exhaustion. But as he drew closer, he saw she was not broken by it. She stood her ground against the gale, her back straight, her chin held with a quiet defiance. This was Lydia Shaw, the response to his advertisement. "Mr. Hayes." Her voice was low, softer than he expected, yet it carried clearly over the wind without a tremor of weakness. "Ma'am," he acknowledged with a stiff nod, his eyes taking in the worn-out soles of her shoes, the guarded look in her deep blue eyes. She looked like a woman who had been running for a very long time. "It's a long ride from Cheyenne. The road is the same length no matter who travels it," she replied, a statement of fact that held no room for pity. He grunted, appreciating the lack of fuss. "The place is inside. The work is hard. The town keeps to itself, mostly." He left the warning unspoken, and they'll have plenty to say about a woman arriving alone at my door. He took her bag, it weighed next to nothing, and led her inside. The air in the house was cool and still smelling of wood smoke and old sorrow. He watched as her gaze swept the main room, taking in the stone hearth, the simple, sturdy furniture, the profound emptiness of the space. Her eyes lingered for a fraction of a second on the small silver-framed photograph of Mary on the mantelpiece. For an instant, the guarded mask on her face slipped, revealing a flash of deep, knowing empathy. An understanding of loss so profound it made Gideon's own breath catch in his throat. Then it was gone, replaced by a polite, professional stillness. As she removed her bonnet, she turned slightly. Her shawl slipped, and with a movement so swift it was almost an act of panic, she pulled it back into place, clutching it tight over her left shoulder. Her fingers were white-knuckled for a moment before she relaxed them. Gideon saw it. He saw the flicker of sheer terror in her eyes. He said nothing, merely pointed towards the stairs. "Your room is at the top. You can start in the morning." She nodded, her face once again an unreadable page. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. You won't regret this." But as Gideon watched her ascend the stairs, her back ramrod straight, he already felt a profound sense of unease. He had hired a housekeeper to bring order to the silence of his home. Instead, he felt he had just let in the wind itself, a strange, mournful wind that carried with it the scent of a storm he could not yet see, and the chill of a secret buried too deep for the light. Weeks bled into a month, and a new quiet rhythm settled over the Hayes ranch. The profound silence Gideon had cultivated as a shield against grief was now filled with softer sounds. The gentle scrape of a broom against the floorboards, the low hum of a song Lydia would sometimes sing while kneading dough, the crisp scent of baking bread that chased the ghosts from the corners of the house. She was a phantom of efficiency, moving through his home with a grace that left order in her wake. Gideon found his world subtly, irrevocably altered. His meals were no longer joyless necessities, but flavorful comforts. His shirts were mended before he even noticed they were torn. The house was no longer a shell. It was becoming a home again, and the realization both soothed and terrified him. He found himself watching her. He'd noticed the way the afternoon light caught the stray hairs at the nape of her neck, or the focused intensity in her eyes as she tended the small herb garden she'd planted near the kitchen window. He saw the strength in her slender frame, a resilience that seemed forged in a fire he couldn't imagine. His carefully constructed solitude was being dismantled brick by silent brick. The moment it all cracked happened on a Tuesday. Rain lashed against the windows, trapping them in the warm, lamplit kitchen. Gideon had come in for a cup of coffee, shaking the cold from his coat. Lydia was at the counter, her back to him, reaching for a jar of preserves on a high shelf. It was just out of her grasp. "Here," Gideon said, stepping up behind her. "Let me." He reached over her, his arm brushing her left shoulder. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. She flinched as if struck by a hot brand, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. She stumbled away from him, her body coiling in on itself, her hands flying up as if to ward off a blow. For a single horrifying second, her eyes were wide with a pure animal terror he had only ever seen in a spooked horse cornered by a wolf. The jar of preserves slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor in a sticky, glittering mess. Lydia Gideon's voice was rough with shock, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to startle you." The mask slammed back into place. The terror vanished, replaced by a frantic, brittle composure. No, it was my fault. I'm so clumsy," she whispered, her voice trembling as she knelt to pick up the broken glass, refusing to meet his eyes. "Forgive me, Mr. Hayes. I wasn't paying attention." He knelt beside her, his heart hammering against his ribs. "It's just a jar, Lydia." He gently took a piece of sharp glass from her trembling hand. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she insisted. But the words were a lie. He saw it in the tremor of her hands and the pale line of her lips. She wasn't clumsy. She was wounded. And her wound was not just in her soul. It was a place on her body she expected to be hurt. He didn't press her. He knew a wall when he saw one, and hers was made of stone and fear. Later that week in town, while waiting for the blacksmith to shod his horse, Gideon stared blankly at the sheriff's notice board. His eyes scanned the usual bounties for horse thieves and cattle rustlers. Then they snagged on a new poster, the ink still dark. Wanted Corbin Fallon. The name meant nothing to him, but the sketch beneath it of a man with a cruel, thin-lipped smile and cold, predatory eyes sent an involuntary shiver down his spine. The crimes listed were vague and brutal: extortion, brutality, theft of property. The notice said he was last seen drifting south from the Wyoming territories. Gideon tore his eyes away, a strange unease settling in his gut. That evening, he watched Lydia from the porch as she watered her herbs in the fading light. A rare, unguarded smile touched her lips as she pinched off a mint leaf, inhaling its scent. It was a look of such fragile peace, such profound and simple beauty that it made his heart ache with a fierce protective instinct. He had offered her a job, a sanctuary. He hadn't intended to offer her his heart. He knew then that his peace was over. He wasn't just fighting the memory of Mary anymore. He was standing on the edge of a new and dangerous frontier, and the name of it was Lydia Shaw. And whatever ghosts were chasing her, he had a terrible feeling they were riding hard and riding straight for his door. The storm broke just after sunset, a wild beast of wind and rain clawing at the steadfast walls of the ranch house. Inside, the world was reduced to the warm, flickering circle of the hearth. The firelight danced across the room, casting long, wavering shadows, turning the small space into a sanctuary against the raging world. Gideon sat in his worn leather chair, the weight of a book resting unread in his lap. His attention was fixed on Lydia. She sat on a stool near the fire, her head bent, the lamplight catching the soft curve of her neck. A needle moved deftly in her fingers, mending a tear in one of his work shirts. The silence between them was no longer the empty, aching silence of his grief, nor the awkward, cautious silence of her arrival. It was something new, a heavy, humming quiet filled with the things they couldn't bring themselves to say. He had fought it, this feeling. Fought it with the memory of Mary, with the discipline of his routine, with the stubborn solitude that had been his only companion. But it was a losing battle. He was lost. He watched the firelight play in her dark hair and knew with a certainty that shook him to his core that he could not go back to the man he was before she came. The house was no longer empty, and neither was his heart. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Lydia. She looked up, her hands stilling, her blue eyes wide and questioning in the soft light. "You don't have to be afraid here," he said, his voice lower and rougher than he intended. "Whatever it is you ran from, it can't find you here. I won't let it. It was the wrong thing to say." Kindness, he realized too late, was a key she had no defense against. Her composure, always so carefully maintained, shattered. Her lips parted in a silent gasp, and her eyes filled with a sudden, devastating tide of tears. The shirt fell from her hands. A single choked sob escaped her, a sound of such profound and hopeless pain, it felt like a physical blow. "Oh, Gideon," she wept, shaking her head, the tears now streaming freely down her pale cheeks. "You don't understand." He rose and knelt before her, his own heart constricting in his chest. He reached out, hesitating, before gently taking her trembling hands in his. "Then make me understand." She looked at him, her face a mask of anguish and shame. "I can't," she whispered, the words torn from her, "because you are a good man. And I'm not clean, Gideon." Her voice dropped, a raw, ragged confession. "I'm not clean." He saw the self-loathing in her eyes, and his heart broke for her. "That's not true. Whatever you've done, whatever mistake you think you've made, it wasn't a mistake," she cried, pulling her hands free. "It was a cage. In her desperation to make him see, to make him recoil and save him from her, she acted. You think you can protect me? You can't. Not from this." She stood her back to him, her shoulders trembling. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Slowly, with hands that shook uncontrollably, she reached for the collar of her worn dress, and the cloth fell. She pushed the fabric aside, exposing the pale skin of her left shoulder to the flickering firelight. Gideon's breath froze in his lungs. His heart, for one agonizing beat, stopped. It wasn't a simple scar. It was a brand. An intricate, hateful symbol of a bird in a cage expertly seared into her flesh. It was a mark of ownership. A declaration that this woman, this kind, quiet, resilient soul, had once been treated as nothing more than livestock. Property. The shock was a physical impact, a blast of ice-cold air in his lungs. It was immediately followed by a surge of pure, white-hot rage, a protective fury so intense it threatened to consume him. Her flinching, her nightmares, the constant vigilant fear in her eyes. It all made a terrible, sickening sense. She stood frozen, her entire body braced for the disgust, the rejection she was so certain would come. Gideon rose slowly, his movements stiff. He stepped behind her. He didn't speak. He simply reached out a trembling hand and gently, with a reverence that felt like a prayer, pulled the cloth back into place, covering the horrific mark. His touch was not one of revulsion. It was a promise. She let out a shuddering breath, a sound of utter disbelief. He rested his hands on her shoulders, his grip firm and steady. The fury in his soul had settled into a cold, lethal calm. He bent his head, his lips close to her ear, his voice a low, dangerous whisper that cut through the sound of the storm. "Tell me his name." The telling of the name was not necessary. In the quiet days that followed the storm, a new language formed between them, spoken in the gentle set of his shoulders, in the way she no longer flinched when he passed behind her. He had seen her deepest wound, and his acceptance had become a balm. The brand was a ghost, they both acknowledged, but its power to haunt was for the first time diminished. A fragile peace settled upon the ranch. It was a peace Gideon drank in like a man dying of thirst. He saw Lydia smile a true, unguarded smile as she watched a foal take its first wobbly steps in the corral. He heard her laugh, a soft, musical sound at one of his own rare, dry jokes. He felt the ice around his heart, the frozen grief for Mary, begin to thaw into something warm and terrifyingly alive. He was standing on the precipice of a new life, a life he had never thought possible, and he was ready to step into it. This fragile hope was what he carried with him as he rode into town for supplies. The sun was warm, the air clean, the world felt new. He gave a nod to the blacksmith, shared a word with the store owner about the price of grain. For the first time in years, he felt a part of the world, not just an observer of it. He was loading sacks of flour into his wagon when a shadow fell over him. Not from a cloud, but from a man. Two men, actually, who had ridden into town and dismounted with the kind of arrogant stillness that sucked the air out of a street. The leader was tall and dressed in a fine dark coat that was immaculate despite the trail dust. He moved with a predator's lazy grace. His eyes, cold and intelligent, swept the town not as a visitor but as an appraiser. Gideon's hand froze on a sack of salt. His blood ran cold. It was him. The face from the poster brought to life. A cruel, thin-lipped smile played on the man's lips as he handed his reins to a startled boy. Corbin Fallon had arrived. Gideon's mind raced. He had to get back. He had to warn her. He began to untie his wagon, his movements clumsy with a sudden sickening urgency. "Pardon me," a smooth voice drawled from behind him. Gideon turned slowly. Fallon stood there, his smile widening slightly, his eyes boring into Gideon with an unnerving intensity. He smelled of expensive cologne and cheap cruelty. "I'm looking for someone," Fallon said, his voice soft yet carrying an unmistakable menace. "A woman. Answers to the name Lydia. Dark hair, blue eyes, a quiet thing. You may have seen her. She has a unique marking." He let the words hang in the air, a veiled threat and a public humiliation all at once. Gideon's face remained a mask of stone, but inside a murderous rage was coiling. "Can't say I have," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Lots of folks pass through." Fallon's eyes narrowed, a flicker of amusement in their depths. "Of course. Well, if you do, there's a handsome reward. She is, after all, my property, and I do dislike it when my things go missing." He gave Gideon a look that was both a dismissal and a warning, then turned and sauntered into the saloon, his associate following like a loyal dog. Property. The word echoed in Gideon's skull a vile desecration of the woman who laughed at his jokes and smiled at his foals. He didn't wait. He left the half-loaded wagon, swung onto his horse, and rode. He rode harder than he ever had in his life, the rhythmic thunder of hooves a desperate prayer against the plains. The wind whipped at his face, but he didn't feel it. He saw only Lydia's terrified eyes in the kitchen, the phantom pain on her shoulder. The ranch house came into view silent and serene against the blue sky. It looked peaceful, untouched. A spike of cold dread pierced Gideon's hope. He'd been gone for hours. Too long. He threw himself from the saddle before the horse had even stopped his boots hitting the porch with a hollow thud. He burst through the door, his hand already on the butt of his Colt. Lydia. The main room was still. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, and Corbin Fallon was sitting in Gideon's chair. He held a cup of coffee, swirling it gently, a look of placid enjoyment on his face. He was alone. Lydia was standing by the far window, her back to the room, her figure rigid, her hands pressed flat against the glass as if she might push her way through it. She was a statue carved from fear. Fallon took a slow sip of his coffee and looked up at Gideon, his lips curving into that same hateful smile. "Hayes, is it?" he said, his voice a silken poison. "I do apologize for the intrusion. Your housekeeper was kind enough to let me in." He set the cup down with a soft click. "I've just come to collect what's mine." The room was a tomb, the air thick and unbreathable. Gideon's gaze locked with Fallon's, a silent primal battle waged across the space of his own hearth. He saw Lydia by the window, a porcelain figure on the verge of shattering. Fallon's smug ownership of the moment of his home of her was a violation that went deeper than blood. "She's not yours to collect." Gideon said, his voice dangerously quiet, each word a stone dropped into a deep well. Fallon let out a soft, amused chuckle. He rose from the chair, moving with a liquid grace that was both elegant and reptilian. "Oh, but she is. I have a bill of sale if you'd care to see it. A considerable investment. Found her in a filthy alley in Laramie, half-starved. I cleaned her up, gave her a purpose. I made her." He took a step towards Lydia, his eyes never leaving Gideon's. "And what I make, I own. She's not a thing." Gideon bit out his hand, dropping his fingers, brushing the worn leather of his holster. "No," Fallon's eyes glittered. He stopped, turning his cruel attention to Lydia, his voice dropping to a caress that was more violent than a shout. "Tell him, Lydia, tell the good rancher what you are. Tell him about the crimson cage. Tell him how you earned that pretty little mark on your shoulder." Lydia flinched as if he had struck her, a low whimper escaping her lips. The sound snapped something in Gideon's soul, but then something in her broke through the ice of her terror. She turned from the window, her face bone-white, her eyes blazing with a hate so pure it was almost beautiful. "No," she whispered the single word, a defiant spark in the suffocating dark. Fallon's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of irritation. "I've indulged this little frontier fantasy long enough." He lunged, grabbing Lydia by the arm and yanking her away from the wall. "We're leaving." "Let her go." Gideon's voice was a low growl. Or what Rancher Fallon sneered, dragging the struggling Lydia towards the door. "You'll shoot me for taking back my property. We'll see how the law in this town feels about a man protecting his investment." He reached the door, his hand on the latch. "Let's go ask them, shall we?" He was going to drag her out onto the porch, to humiliate her, to break her in front of the world. To make Gideon's choice a public one. In that instant, Gideon was no longer a grieving widower or a lonely rancher. He was a wall, a line drawn in the sand. He moved his body, a blur of purpose, and blocked the doorway. He stood between Fallon and the outside world, between Lydia's past and her future. Her name, Gideon said, his voice ringing with an absolute, unshakable authority, is Lydia Shaw. She is a free woman, and she is under my protection. Fallon's face twisted in a mask of fury. The game was over. Then you can die with her. He shoved Lydia aside and drew his gun, a silver-plated Colt that appeared in his hand like a magic trick. But Gideon was a man of the earth, not of parlor tricks. He was faster. His own pistol, a rugged, well-oiled peacemaker, was already clearing leather. The world exploded in a deafening roar. Wood splintered from the doorframe as Fallon's shot went wide. Gideon's shot was true. It caught Fallon in the shoulders, spinning him around. He cried out a sound of shocked rage. The room was a chaos of smoke and thunder. Fallon, snarling, fired again, the bullet tearing a groove in the mantelpiece, shattering the silver frame of Mary's photograph. As Fallon steadied himself for a final killing shot, Lydia acted. With a wild cry, she threw the heavy iron poker from the hearth. It spun end over end, striking Fallon's gun hand with a sickening crunch of bone. The silver Colt clattered to the floor. Fallon stared at his broken hand in disbelief, his face a canvas of agony and hate. He looked up at Gideon, his eyes promising murder. Gideon didn't hesitate. He fired again. The shot was the only sound in the universe. It echoed, and then died, leaving a silence that was more profound than the noise it replaced. Corbin Fallon crumpled to the floorboards, his reign of poison and possession over. The ghost was gone. Gideon stood his chest, heaving, the pistol still smoking in his hand. The scent of gunpowder was thick in the air. He looked at the wreckage of his home, at the shattered picture of his past. Then he looked at Lydia. She stood amidst the chaos, her breath coming in ragged sobs, her eyes fixed on him. In her gaze he saw not a victim, but a survivor, a fighter. The battle was over. But as the ringing in his ears subsided and he saw the woman he loved standing in the ruins of the life he once knew, he understood that the war for their future had only just begun. The gunshot echoed, then faded, leaving a silence that pressed in on all sides, broken only by the ragged sound of two people breathing in the ruins of a life. The air was acrid with the smell of gunpowder and finality. On the floor, the ghost from the past lay still, a mere man, now his power to torment extinguished forever. Gideon's knuckles were white around the grip of his peacemaker. He felt a tremor in his hand, the last of the adrenaline leaving him in a cold, hollowing rush. He looked at the splintered doorframe, the shattered photograph of Mary, the dark stain spreading on his floorboards. The past had come to his door, and he had met it with violence. He had killed a man in his own home. He looked at Lydia. She hadn't moved. She stood with the iron poker held loosely in her hand, her face pale, but her eyes blazing. She was not the frightened creature by the window anymore. She was a warrior standing in the aftermath of her own liberation. Their eyes met across the wreckage, and in that single shared glance an entire world of understanding passed between them. They were no longer a rancher and his housekeeper. They were survivors. The sound of approaching horses broke the spell. Fast. More than one. "Stay behind me," Gideon said, his voice a low command. He reloaded his pistol with a steady hand, the familiar clicks a small grounding comfort. He didn't know if it was Fallon's associate or the town, and at that moment it didn't matter. No one was touching her again. It was the town. Sheriff Miller appeared in the doorway first, his old face grim, his shotgun held at a low ready. Behind him, a half-dozen townsfolk peered, their faces a morbid tapestry of fear and suspicion. They saw the body on the floor. They saw the smoking pistol in Gideon's hand. And they saw Lydia, the soiled woman, the source of all the trouble. Gideon the sheriff's voice was heavy with a weary resignation. What in God's name happened here? He came for her. Gideon stated, his voice flat and hard as iron. I stopped him. A woman from the back of the crowd gasped. It's her fault. She brought this darkness here. The old prejudice, the easy, ignorant fear, was a poison that lingered. But before Gideon could unleash the cold fury that was building in his chest, Lydia stepped forward. She was no longer hiding. "My name is Lydia Shaw," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing through the tense quiet. It did not tremble. "That man on the floor was my jailer. Not my lover, not my partner. My jailer." She looked directly at the woman who had accused her. "He did not bring darkness here. He was the darkness I ran from. And Mr. Hayes brought me into the light." Her words, simple and potent, hung in the air. She did not offer details. She did not plead. She stated her truth. Gideon tossed the wanted poster onto a crate near the door. "His name is Corbin Fallon, a wanted man." He called her his property. I disagreed. Sheriff Miller looked from the poster to the dead man's cold, cruel face. He looked at Lydia's defiant, tear-streaked face and at Gideon's unyielding stance. He was an old man who had seen the worst of the West, and he knew the truth when it stood before him, smelling of gunpowder and righteous anger. He lowered his shotgun. Self-defense. Then he declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. He turned to the gawking crowd. "Show's over. Go on home. Let these folks have their peace." Slowly the crowd dispersed, their whispers fading into the night. The law for once had seen past the brand, past the rumors, and had settled on the side of justice. The hours that followed were a blur of grim necessity. The sheriff helped Gideon wrap the body. A wagon was brought. By the time the sun began to hint at its arrival, the house was quiet again. The physical ghost was gone. They were alone. They worked together wordlessly to clean the wreckage. They swept up the broken glass. They righted the furniture. With each small act of restoration, they were not just cleaning a room. They were building a new world in the ashes of the old one. When there was nothing left to do, they stood in the center of the room, exhausted and raw. Gideon Lydia began, her voice soft. He simply shook his head and opened his arms. She stepped into them without hesitation, bearing her face in his chest, and he held her as she finally truly wept. She wept for the girl she had been, for the years she had lost, for the terror that was finally over. And he held her, his own grief, his own loneliness, washing away with her tears. Days later, they sat on the porch watching the sunset, painting the vast prairie in hues of gold and rose. The house was clean. A new pane of glass was in the window. The world was quiet. Lydia wore a simple dress, her arms bare in the warm evening air. She no longer hid. Gideon reached out, his calloused fingers gently tracing the edge of the ugly, faded brand on her shoulder. It was just a scar, now a map of a place she had escaped. "Does it still hurt?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes on the endless horizon. "No," she said softly. "It's just a reminder that I survived." He looked out at the land, his land. It was no longer a kingdom of loneliness. It was a promise. "Lydia," he said, his heart full, "I love you." She turned to him, a real, brilliant smile finally reaching her eyes, chasing away the last of the shadows. She didn't need to say the words back. He saw it in her gaze, a truth more profound than any spoken vow. "I know," she whispered. And for the first time she was truly, completely home.